So our task today is to look at a series of events that actually took place over several hundred years. That's called the Crusades. All right, again, the Crusades are a series of events, and as we tend to do, we're simply going to sum it up. For us, we look at the idea that West and East are going to split in two based on religious preference. Now, a division had occurred within Christianity that stretched back hundreds of years. Rome used Latin, and Constantinople used Greek. So it starts with a language barrier, and the gap between the two grew wider after the Roman Empire fell in the West. Now, the practices of the clergy got even more divisive after the year 1000, where the Western Church gave supremacy to the Pope, who lives here, while the Byzantines recognized the Patriarch of Constantinople as the true leader. Orthodox priests used yeast in the Eucharist, while the Westerners used unleavened bread. And this unleavened bread is the symbolism of consuming the body of Christ during the Eucharist. When a bishop in Bulgaria, so a bishop in Bulgaria wrote a letter to an Italian bishop in 1054 criticizing church practices, the Pope responded by sending an envoy to the Patriarch of Constantinople with 2 letters defending these practices. The escalation reached a point to where the Pope's envoy excommunicated the Patriarch, and the Patriarch did the same to the Pope's envoy. Officially, it's going to take until 1965, an event known as Vatican II, to resolve this issue. But to this day, the split between West and East remains. The Pope is the head of the Roman Catholic Church, centered in the West. The Patriarch of Constantinople is head of the Eastern Orthodox Church, sometimes called Greek Orthodox. All right, so there is a clear religious and cultural divide between East and West. That's how this whole thing begins. Now, fast forward several decades. All right, so fast forward about 4 decades. The Byzantines. The Byzantines do enjoy their bit of power. We can see the extent of their rule at around the turn of the century, so the 1090s we're talking about. The Byzantines are fighting off Muslim expansionary threats to their power base. There are 2 groups we see here, the Fatimids and the Seljuks. They're both Muslim, and the Seljuks had actually taken over 2 of the 5 cities with patriarchs of the faith, Antioch and Jerusalem, while Alexandria is also in Muslim hands. So 3 of the 5 most important cities in Christendom are in Muslim hands. Now the Turks are closing in on Constantinople, and they're threatening Byzantine lands. The Byzantines are actually very weak in regard to their military, and this goes back 25 years to a defeat by the Muslims. Now, despite the differences with the West, this man, the Byzantine Emperor Alexius, appeals to the Pope in Rome to send military assistance. It's more of a request for Christendom to unite against a Muslim threat. Now, Pope Urban II responded by convening a council at Clermont in France in the year 1095. And he called on those assembled to recover Jerusalem. And this isn't quite what the Byzantines had asked for. They didn't ask to help recover Jerusalem. They asked for military assistance to beat back the Muslim threat. It's very clear that we are moving into religious territory rather than simple military assistance. It becomes a religious crusade when the Pope promises forgiveness of sins for any and all who died en route, which is called an indulgence. 50,000 soldiers answered the call. and 10,000 of them actually reached Jerusalem, and only about 1,500 of that number were actual knights with the proper equipment to wage siege warfare. Now, the first group to reach Constantinople was called the People's Crusade, and it was led by a guy named Peter the Hermit, and the group was a general embarrassment. Alexius, the Byzantine emperor, was kind of shocked that this was the first group of Westerners to show up, so he got them out of the city as fast as possible, and they were slaughtered by the Turks. Since Europe, or at least Western Europe, was really viewed as a backwater to begin with, the People's Crusade relaxed the Turks a bit too much. So when legitimate trained knights showed up, they weren't expecting them to be as threatening as they really were. Now, this concept of shady actions refers to the fact that when the actual Western Crusaders arrived, they swore an oath on the relics of the Holy Cross that they would hand over any and all towns they conquered that formerly were part of the Byzantine Empire. In other words, they're going to give the Byzantines their land back. Now, this indicated the belief that the Byzantines viewed the mission in military terms, but Westerners broke these promises when they had the opportunity for economic gain. So it begins with a religious call in the West, and when profit can be made, profit is going to be made. That's one of the main things we see occurring as far as the Western account of the Crusades are concerned. Now, we can sum this all up in one slide. Depending on who you ask, there were a total of 8 to 12 crusades. But really, we can look at the first crusade and then the rest. Now remember, the Byzantine military purpose was to push back the advancing Turks, but the new Western purpose was to reclaim control of the Holy Land from the Muslims. About 3.5 years after Pope Urban called for this first crusade, Jerusalem fell to Western knights following a 6-week siege, and you can see depicted right here the siege of Jerusalem. Now, these warriors were well equipped for siege warfare because the walled-off castles of Western Europe required these skills. It was bloody, to say the least. One witness claimed that the streets of Jerusalem were filled with dead bodies, and that your feet would have been stained to the ankles with the blood of the slain. Neither women nor children were spared. The Western leaders of this crusade became household names, and new overseas colonies were planted that were under Western control, like Jerusalem, Tripoli, Tyre, and Antioch. They all become ruled by Western laws and traditions such as feudalism and Western-style tax collection. The journey east was also a disaster for Jews along the way, and they were slaughtered in areas like the Rhineland, which is in modern Germany, seen as retaliation for the crucifixion of Jesus. So we see bloody results in Jerusalem. We see bloody results regarding anti-Semitism as this crusade takes hold. Now, as to the rest, tensions between Christianity and Islam are going to truly reach a breaking point during the Third Crusade. Saladin, the man you see pictured here, Saladin was a general based out of Egypt, and he made an alliance with Constantinople. So we see the original allies, the Eastern and Western Christians, turning on each other. He made an alliance with Constantinople, and he realized that residents of the Holy Land were growing tired of decisions made by faraway Western leaders. Saladin's troops easily reclaimed Jerusalem. The citizens actually opened the gates and let them in. And this led to the mobilization of the most powerful kings in Europe. Philip II of France, Frederick Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor, and Richard I of England, so Richard the Lionheart. The three leaders couldn't agree on strategy. One wanted to focus on Egypt instead of Jerusalem, and in the end, the three simply turned their attention to Acre, a port city in modern-day Israel, and it was a critical trading center that had zero religious value. So here we see again, economics is going to take the lead in military decisions. It gets so bad that as part of the Fourth Crusade, Western knights sacked the city of Constantinople, the city that first called for their aid over 100 years prior is going to get sacked. and they're going to hold it for about 60 years. Now, the Venetians, who had risen in importance by this time, the city of Venice, they actually struck a bargain with the West, and the fact that Western Christians were willing to take over the most important city in Eastern Christendom, it really shows how far the men had fallen from their original purpose. So that kind of sums up the actual fighting of these Crusades. Now, what's the point? What have we learned? What matters? When the rest of the Crusades are taken into account, it really paints a picture of how much had changed in the Mediterranean basin once everything ended. A significant change was the growth in the power of what are called Italian city-states, like Venice and Pisa and Genoa. They are well positioned for maritime trade or water-based trade, and they began to build up their arsenal of ships and their trade contacts with the East. New middle classes will begin to emerge, markets are going to boom, and there's more urbanization in these areas. And it's going to lay the groundwork for an event called the Renaissance. Now, for a fairly decent portion of this crusading era, relations between individual Christians and Muslims they're fairly reasonable. Crusaders from the West really became adept at learning how to deal with a majority Muslim population in the lands that they conquered. Recent arrivals to the Holy Land, they had been inundated with this propaganda about how bad and evil Muslims were, and they couldn't believe the fact that trade and interactions between Christian and Muslims take place on a daily basis. But as time wore on, these attitudes began to level off. And according to one Arabic source, those who had spent significant time in the Holy Land were much better than those who had recently arrived. Muslims were routinely shocked at the crude habits of new arrivals, but also, more significantly, they were shocked at the attitudes they had towards non-Christians. There also were negative attitudes in the opposite direction. Now, a declaration was issued in the 1140s decreeing that Muslims should not travel to the West or trade with any Christians because they would use money to finance more crusades. Despite all this, each side showed genuine curiosity towards each other. So the individual interactions, not so bad. Ideas, cultural exchanges, scientific and intellectual ideas will make their way from the Muslim world back to Western Europe. This will lead to more learning, eventually leading to a so-called Age of Reason. Copies of algorithmic tables were found in the libraries of Antioch and Damascus, and they helped form the basis of mathematics in the West. The Quran was actually translated into Latin for a Western audience, and the works of Greeks like Aristotle, who have been preserved by Muslim scholars, will make their way back to Christian audiences. Now, these works begin to flow west with the Crusades, and they also enter the Europe. It's often referred to as entering through the back door of Muslim Spain. And finally, it's about the money. Trade begins its long climb back. Luxury goods from the East became all the rage in the West. And we're talking things like silk, linen, and fabrics from the Eastern Mediterranean or even China. Antioch becomes a major trading and production center, and cloth of Antioch garners special status. It was actually so famous that England's King Henry III had special Antioch chambers in each of his 4 main residences. Spices are coming in from the Far East to Constantinople, Jerusalem, and Alexandria. Then it goes to Italian middlemen, and then to continental Europe and the British Isles. So not only did Europe and Constantinople reunite, but goods from as far as East Asia became more commonplace in royal courts and were part of an exotic part of European life. So what's the significance of the Crusades? It leads to the Renaissance. It leads to cultural, scientific, and intellectual exchange. But maybe most important, large-scale trade will resume between East and West.